Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. I'm sorry, but rules are rules. These words hung in the air as the elderly woman's hands trembled against her boarding pass. The morning crowd shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between watches and phones. Nobody wanted to be late for their own flights. The airline employee's voice carried the practiced indifference of someone who had said no 1,000 times before, each refusal easier than the last. What he didn't notice was the tall figure in the baseball cap who had stopped scrolling on his phone, his attention now fully fixed on the unfolding scene. Terminal 3 buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Business people clutching coffee cups, families corralling sleepy children, security announcements echoing above the din. Margaret Wilson stood at the counter, her 75-year-old frame looking suddenly small beneath the fluorescent lights. "But I've been planning this trip for months," she explained, voice steady despite her shaking hands. "My grandchildren are waiting." The airline employee sighed, tapping his keyboard with pointed impatience. "As I said, there's a discrepancy in your documentation. I can't let you board." Behind them, the line of passengers grew, their collective frustration adding to the mounting tension. Margaret's shoulders slumped as she fumbled with her purse. 45 years of teaching children had taught her dignity in difficult moments. "I understand," she said, though her eyes told a different story. The employee had already looked past her, calling, "Next," to the line. That's when a deep voice cut through the airport noise. "Excuse me." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Heads turned as Dwayne Johnson stepped forward, removing his sunglasses. Recognition rippled through the crowd. The moment that would go viral on 3 continents was about to unfold. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. The airline employee's expression shifted from boredom to surprise as he recognized the imposing figure approaching his counter. At 6'5", Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson commanded attention even in civilian clothes. A simple black t-shirt stretched across his broad shoulders and a baseball cap pulled low. But it wasn't his celebrity status that changed the atmosphere. It was the deliberate calm in his movements, the respectful nod he gave to Margaret as he stepped beside her. "What seems to be the problem here?" Johnson asked, his tone conversational but carrying unmistakable gravity. Margaret looked up, momentary confusion giving way to recognition. "There's an issue with my documentation," she explained, her teacher's voice steady despite her distress. "My married name doesn't match my maiden name on some forms. I've been trying to explain." "Sir, I'm handling this situation," the employee interrupted, his customer service smile returning too quickly. "We have procedures that must be followed. Perhaps I can help you with your own travel arrangements." Behind them, the line had grown silent. Phones were discreetly raised, recording what everyone sensed was becoming something significant. The early morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting everyone in the harsh light of reality. "I appreciate that," Johnson replied, his smile genuine, but his eyes serious. "But I'm actually interested in understanding why this lady can't board her flight." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, how long have you been teaching?" The question seemed to surprise her. 45 years, elementary school. I retired last spring." Johnson nodded as if this confirmed something important. He turned back to the employee whose name tag read Derek. "So Derek, we've got a teacher who's dedicated her life to educating kids, and she's trying to visit her grandchildren. There's a small paperwork issue that you have the power to resolve. I'm just wondering what the right thing to do here might be." Derek's confidence wavered. "Sir, with all due respect, airline policy is very clear about documentation requirements. I don't make the rules." "Nobody's asking you to break rules," Johnson replied evenly. "I'm just wondering if there might be a solution we haven't explored yet." The crowd was growing. Passengers from other lines were drifting over, recognition spreading as whispers of "It's the Rock" rippled through the terminal. Someone in the back called out, "Help her out, man!" followed by scattered applause. Derek glanced nervously at his supervisor's office, clearly calculating his options. Margaret stood straighter now, her dignity returning. "I have my marriage certificate," she offered, producing a folder of carefully organized documents. "And my teaching credentials with both names. I've traveled this way before without issue." Johnson's presence seemed to grow larger without him moving an inch. He wasn't playing a role now, not a wrestler, not an action hero, but something more authentic. A man who understood the difference between power and leadership. "Look, Derek," he said, leaning slightly forward, his voice lowered but still caring to those nearby. "We all have jobs to do. I respect that. But sometimes our job is to find solutions, not just enforce problems. This woman has taught thousands of kids over decades. Think about that impact. All she wants is to see her grandchildren." Derek's eyes darted between Johnson, Margaret, and the growing crowd of onlookers. A subtle shift was occurring in the atmosphere. Not just celebrity recognition, but something deeper. The morning rush of self-interested travelers was transforming into a community witnessing a moment of truth. The distinction between those with power and those without was being quietly challenged in the fluorescent-lit banality of Terminal 3. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor," Derek finally said, reaching for his phone. The small concession felt like a victory, and Margaret's eyes shone with renewed hope. "Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching." Derek's supervisor emerged from her office moments later, a stern-looking woman in her 40s with a tailored suit and an expression that suggested interruptions were unwelcome. Her name badge identified her as Linda Mercer, Customer Service Manager. She surveyed the scene quickly, the growing crowd, the phones recording, and of course the unmistakable presence of Dwayne Johnson. Her professional smile appeared instantly. "Mr. Johnson, what an unexpected pleasure," she said, extending her hand. "I understand there's a situation I can help with." Johnson shook her hand firmly but redirected immediately. "Actually, Ms. Mercer, it's Mrs. Wilson here who needs assistance." He stepped slightly aside, ensuring Margaret remained center stage in this unfolding drama. "She's having documentation issues that seem solvable with a bit of flexibility." Linda turned to Margaret with the practiced patience of someone who had delivered thousands of polite refusals. "I understand your frustration, ma'am, but I've reviewed your case on my way over. The name discrepancy is unfortunately a security issue we cannot overlook. Perhaps rebooking for another day when your documentation is in order." "My documentation is in order," Margaret interrupted, her teacher's voice carrying the quiet authority that had silenced rowdy classrooms for decades. "I have multiple forms of ID confirming both my maiden and married names." She produced her folder again, laying out her driver's license, passport, and marriage certificate with methodical precision. "I've flown to see my grandchildren twice a year for the past decade without issue." The crowd had grown restless. A businessman in line spoke up. "Come on, let her through. We're all going to be late at this rate." Others murmured in agreement, the collective mood shifting from impatient observation to active involvement. Linda's professional smile tightened. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but airline security protocols are important," Johnson completed her sentence. "Absolutely. No one's disputing that. But they're meant to protect people, not become barriers to reasonable solutions. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the delicate situation developing. A celebrity was involved, cameras were recording, and public opinion was clearly not on the airline's side. She lowered her voice, addressing Johnson directly. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can find an accommodation for you and Mrs. Wilson." Johnson's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. "I appreciate that offer, but this isn't about me getting special treatment. This is about doing the right thing for Mrs. Wilson, celebrity involvement or not." Margaret stood taller now, emboldened by the support. "I just want to see my grandchildren. My daughter is expecting her third child next week. I promised I'd be there to help." A young woman with a toddler stepped forward from the line. "Excuse me, but I actually know Mrs. Wilson. She was my third-grade teacher in Chicago." The unexpected testimony silenced the growing murmurs. "Mrs. Wilson, you probably don't remember me. I'm Jessica Martinez. You helped me learn English when I first moved here from Guatemala." Margaret's eyes widened with recognition and sudden tears. "Jessica, of course I remember you. You wrote that beautiful poem about butterflies crossing borders." The coincidence seemed almost too perfect, but that's how real life sometimes unfolds. Unexpected connections in unexpected places. Jessica turned to Linda. "Mrs. Wilson changes lives. I became a teacher because of her. Please, help her." The humanity of the moment was palpable. Others in line began sharing similar sentiments, not about knowing Margaret specifically, but about teachers who had impacted their own lives. The individual problem was transforming into a symbolic stand for respect and compassion. Johnson had remained quiet during this exchange, understanding that the most powerful moment was unfolding without his celebrity influence. But as Linda hesitated, clearly calculating the public relations implications, he stepped forward again. "You know, Linda," Johnson said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who understood both power and responsibility, "I've played a lot of heroes in movies. Guys who save the world, defeat the bad guys, perform impossible stunts." He smiled, the charm that had made him a global celebrity on full display. But the real heroes, they're people like Mrs. Wilson, the ones who shape minds, who show up day after day to help others become their best selves. The terminal had grown remarkably quiet. The background announcements about security and gate changes seemed distant and irrelevant compared to the human drama unfolding at the check-in counter. Linda glanced at her watch, then at the growing crowd, the many phones recording, and finally at Margaret's hopeful face. Whatever calculation she was making behind her professional expression, it wasn't solely about airline protocols anymore. "The flight is boarding in 20 minutes, she said finally. Under normal circumstances, this would require escalation to TSA and likely rebooking on a later flight. The collective disappointment was palpable, a wave of sighs and murmured disapproval. But Linda wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "given the extenuating circumstances and the clear verification of identity through multiple documents, I believe we can proceed with a special verification form." She turned to Derek. "Please prepare a form SSR 42 for Mrs. Wilson with my authorization code." Derek nodded, fingers already typing on his keyboard. The tension in the terminal deflated like a balloon, replaced by scattered applause and relieved smiles. But Johnson sensed the moment wasn't complete. There was a lesson here that transcended one woman's flight or one celebrity's intervention. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below and let's talk. As Derek processed the special verification form, Johnson placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Mrs. Wilson, while they're taking care of the paperwork. Would you mind if I asked you something?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Of course not. 45 years of teaching, that's incredible. What kept you going all those years?" The question wasn't performative, there was genuine curiosity in his voice. The crowd around them quieted, sensing something authentic unfolding. Margaret considered for a moment. "The children," she said simply. "Every year, 25 new faces would look up at me, waiting to be guided, challenged, supported. Some came from wonderful homes, others from terrible circumstances. But in my classroom, they all deserved the same chance, the same respect." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "You know, many people think teaching is about information, math, reading, science, but it's really about seeing potential in each child and helping them believe in themselves." Johnson nodded slowly. "Leadership?" he said. "Yes," Margaret agreed, "though I never thought of it that way." The terminal had fallen into a reverent hush. Even those not directly involved in the scene had stopped to listen, sensing the unexpected wisdom being exchanged between an elderly teacher and a global superstar. "I've been fortunate in my career," Johnson continued, his voice carrying easily to the gathered crowd. "Movies, wrestling, businesses, I've had success in different arenas, but everything I've accomplished came from lessons people like you taught me. Coaches, teachers who saw something in me even when I didn't see it myself." Margaret's eyes glistened with emotion. "That's the magic of it. We never know which words, which small encouragements might change a life's trajectory." Linda returned with the completed form and a boarding pass. "Mrs. Wilson, you're all set. We've made a note in the system about your documentation for future flights as well." Her professional demeanor had softened, touched by the exchange she'd witnessed. "Thank you," Margaret said, accepting the boarding pass with steady hands. Then she turned back to Johnson. "And thank you. Not just for helping me, but for understanding why it mattered." Johnson shook his head. "Don't thank me. This moment isn't about celebrity intervention. It's about recognizing true leadership when we see it." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his presence commanding but humble. "Look, we're all busy. We all have places to be, deadlines to meet. It's easy to walk past moments like this. Someone struggling, needing help, and think it's not our problem." His gaze swept across the terminal, making eye contact with strangers who suddenly felt like a community. But true strength isn't about how much you can bench press or how famous you are. He gestured toward Margaret. It's about seeing someone in need and having the courage to stand beside them. Mrs. Wilson did that for thousands of kids over decades. The least we can do is follow her example. Phones recorded every word, but this wasn't a performance. There was an authenticity to his message that transcended social media potential. People weren't just capturing a celebrity sighting, they were documenting a moment of genuine human connection and wisdom. Derek, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Wilson, I owe you an apology." The admission seemed to cost him effort, but his voice grew stronger as he continued. "I was following procedure without considering the person in front of me. I'm sorry." The simple apology carried weight in its unexpectedness. Margaret reached across the counter and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you, young man. That takes character." Linda announced that they would begin boarding Johnson's flight first, a gesture that seemed like special treatment, but Johnson politely declined. "Mrs. Wilson should board first. She's waited long enough." As Margaret gathered her belongings, Johnson helped with her carry-on bag. She looked up at him with teacher-like assessment. "You know, Mr. Johnson, you would have made an excellent teacher yourself." Johnson laughed, a genuine sound that filled the terminal. "Maybe in my next career, Mrs. Wilson." The final pieces of the scene fell into place with a perfect, unscripted humanity. Linda personally escorted Margaret toward the security checkpoint, the path clearing respectfully before them. Johnson remained at the counter, resuming his place in line as if he were any other passenger. But the terminal had changed. Strangers who moments before had been isolated in their travel bubbles were now talking to each other, sharing observations about what they'd witnessed. A woman near the back wiped away tears. A businessman put away his phone, seemingly reconsidering his priorities. Parents who had watched the scene unfold knelt to speak more attentively with their children. As Margaret disappeared from view toward her gate, she turned once more to wave, not just to Johnson, but to everyone who had been part of this unexpected moment. The wave of a teacher, dignified and warm, who had inadvertently delivered one more lesson. It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. By mid-afternoon, the first videos appeared online. Shaky smartphone footage captured from different angles told the same story. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson standing up for an elderly teacher against airline bureaucracy. The clips spread rapidly across platforms, each share adding context, emotion, and personal connection. This is why I respected The Rock more than any other celebrity. Real leadership isn't about fame. It's about helping others. Real strength, teacher respect. My grandmother was a teacher for 38 years. Watching this made me call her immediately to say thank you. Teachers change lives. I was there. What the videos don't fully capture is how he made it about her, not him. No ego, just genuine respect. News outlets picked up the story by evening, their headlines capturing different facets of the moment that had resonated with millions. The Rock shows what real strength looks like. Viral airport moment celebrates teachers' impact. Celebrity intervention changes airline policy conversation. But perhaps most significant was the airline's official response, released as the story gained traction. This morning's events at Terminal 3 have prompted an important conversation within our organization about balancing security protocols with customer compassion. We are reviewing our documentation policies to better accommodate situations like Mrs. Wilson's while maintaining necessary security standards. Margaret's daughter posted a photo that evening. Her mother arrived safely, surrounded by beaming grandchildren. Mom made it. Huge thank you to The Rock for helping her when the airline gave her trouble. She taught thousands of kids over 45 years, and today her impact came full circle. Teachers rock. Johnson shared the post with his millions of followers, adding, "The honor was all mine. Mrs. Wilson represents the true heroes, teachers who shape our future every day without recognition or fanfare. If my small gesture helps remind us of their value, that's a win." Respect our teachers. The story evolved beyond its original participants. Teachers shared their own experiences of being undervalued. Former students posted tributes to educators who had changed their lives. Parents sent appreciation notes to their children's teachers. A spontaneous campaign emerged, number Thank a Teacher Today. Even Derek, the airline employee, found unexpected support. Comments recognized the difficult position of frontline workers caught between rigid corporate policies and human needs. Shout out to Derek for having the courage to admit his mistake. Growth mindset in action. Never too late to learn. 3 days later, a school district in Chicago invited Johnson to speak at their teacher appreciation event. He accepted immediately with one condition, that Margaret Wilson be invited as the main honoree. A week after the airport incident, Johnson posted a video that quickly surpassed even his usual engagement metrics. He was seated beside Margaret at her daughter's home, the new baby visible in the background. "I want to thank everyone who shared our airport moment," he began. "But the real story isn't about celebrity intervention. It's about recognizing leadership in all its forms." Margaret spoke next, her teacher's voice clear and purposeful. "In 45 years of teaching, I learned that true authority doesn't come from power or position. It comes from seeing others, really seeing them, and standing beside them when they need support." The camera pulled back to reveal several of Margaret's former students who had arranged to visit after learning of the viral story. Among them was Jessica Martinez, the woman from the airport, now holding her toddler. "Mrs. Wilson taught me that borders, whether between countries, people, or possibilities, only have the power we give them," Jessica said. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see you, to help you cross." The video ended with Johnson's characteristic mix of intensity and sincerity. "We all have moments where we can choose to walk past or step up. The strongest thing you'll ever do isn't in a gym. It's when you stand beside someone who needs an ally. That's real strength. That's the lesson Mrs. Wilson and teachers everywhere have been showing us all along." The video's final frame captured an unscripted moment. Johnson listening attentively as Margaret shared a story with the gathered group, his celebrity completely secondary to her wisdom. A simple hashtag appeared: #Real Leaders Listen. In a world of fleeting viral moments, this one left something lasting. Not just a heartwarming story, but a reminder that true leadership exists in unexpected places. In airport terminals, in elementary school classrooms, and in the everyday courage to stand beside those who need an advocate. Wow, what a story! If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.